think about what does it mean for us in 2020 to build back better from COVID, from the pandemic that we found ourselves in, from lockdown, from all of these different phrases and words that we keep hearing and referring to. So before we dig into tonight's passage and tonight's concept and idea, I want to just share a little bit of a story with you, a little bit of a thing that I have probably clocked yesterday and thought through. So 7 months ago, at the beginning of lockdown, Lisa and I had our first child, Ada. She was 7 months old this week and is loving life and lots of food at the moment. More on the floor and on the high chair than actually in her mouth, but that's not the story. Yesterday, I was in Calendar meeting with some young people, socially distanced outside, following all the appropriate guidelines. So we decided to go on a walk. Calendar's a great place for a walk, so that's where we went for a walk with these young people. And I had Ada with me, and I thought, I'll tell you what, I won't take the pram because it's a faff to go on a walk with a pram. Let's take the baby carrier thing that you strap here. Okay, so Ada has always enjoyed her baby carrier from being born. Originally, she was kind of like tucked in, facing me, and all nice and warm. At one point, Alistair actually saw me with the baby carrier on and questioned whether I even had the baby with me because she was so snuggled in. At one point, he was like, Rob, I saw you and Lisa out walking the other day. Where was the baby? And I was like, it's fine. She was tucked into my coat. Don't panic. She's now a little bit bigger than that, a little bit older than that. And she can now do this thing in the last few weeks where you can turn around and she can face out and see everything that's around her. And she loves this, absolutely loves being able to see who's coming towards her, being able to feel the wind and the rain, because she knows she's a good Scottish baby, and she's used to the weather already. On her face, she likes to talk to people in her gibberish as they walk towards her. And sometimes I think she's just giving me a running commentary of what she is seeing around her. And what I was thinking about as I was bringing this talk together and thinking about the topic that we're going to explore this evening is that for her, every view that she has from that baby carrier is a whole new perspective. It's the first time she's maybe seen a certain thing or a certain person, seen something from a certain way. And the entire time you can tell that her brain is learning new things, is learning how things work. She's taking things on. And that leads us into tonight, because tonight we're going to look at this idea of looking at things from a new perspective. And for her, as a 7-month-old who's sat in a whole new position or in a whole new place, everything she sees is from a new perspective. And I wonder what it would look like for us to look at society, to look at church, to look at culture with a whole new perspective. This week, I've also been reading some blog posts around this idea of a new perspective and what is God trying to teach us from this time of lockdown. And this blog opens up by saying, not only are we navigating through the daily challenges of a post-COVID world, we're faced with tough questions about who we are, where we've been, and what's important to us. We see that politics are polarized, racism is still a real threat, society has been and continues to be shaken. Now, none of that is probably new to anybody in this room. We all know that 2020 has been a roller coaster of a year. To be honest, I'm not sure anything now in 2020 could really surprise us or shock us. But that's not the point. The point is, what are we going to do from this point? What are we going to do differently? How are we going to lead and follow Jesus differently? That same blog goes on to suggest, that behind the noise of all that's going on, of the media, of the headlines, of the conspiracy theories, of the different ideas, they're convinced, the writer of this blog is convinced that there's an alternative story. More of a whisper than a loud noise. And it's a whisper that we, as Jesus' followers, have to lean in to hear. And that's the story of God at work, who's always at work. And the ways in which he is using this time of great struggle to shake us out of our old ways and into something new. He's putting his finger on aspects of culture and church that he is calling us to see with fresh eyes. And this is what we've been talking about over the last few weeks. How do we build back better? How do we see things differently? How do we focus on what God is saying and showing us that needs to be done better? So 2 weeks ago, we looked at the idea of how we need to do this together and how coming together brings us into a place of strength and support For many of us over that lockdown between March and kind of June, July time, we probably found ourselves in communities or connecting with people that we'd never really connected with before. Whether that was via technology, whether that was next door neighbors that you actually spoke to, whether that was people that you just ended up connecting with because of the situation that you found yourselves in. And then last week we looked at this idea that actually we are equal. We are each equal, and the injustices and the inequality in our world is something that we need to constantly be battling and changing. We're equal, and that's how God designed us to be. And this week, we're going to have a think about a third element of how do we move forward with this idea of newness, of things being new, of things changing. How are we comfortable and confident to follow Jesus and lead in that time? So as I mentioned, we're using the book of Nehemiah to kind of pull out some ideas about how we do this. And we've been looking into the lessons that we can learn from Nehemiah and his experience of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Now, I warned you at the beginning of this series that we were not doing a logical step-by-step walkthrough of Nehemiah. We weren't even doing a deep dive into Nehemiah as a book. And just to keep you all on your toes and confuse you, in fact, this week we've gone backwards. So last week we were in chapter 5, and we've gone back to chapter 1 just to keep you all on your toes and all thinking about what does Nehemiah have to say. Because it comes in Nehemiah 1 and the beginning of Nehemiah 2 that I want to suggest that Nehemiah gives us a framework on how we approach this newness. And what do we do as Jesus' followers to walk into this well? And I want to suggest that this framework is useful for us as we continue to look at how we continue to work out our faith in this new world. So let's look at Nehemiah. Let's look where he was in the context that we read from this evening's passage and see what it has to teach us about that framework. So we've read Nehemiah 1 and 3, but just to remind you, these are the words of Nehemiah. He introduces himself, tells us who he is and who he is the son of. And it says, now it happened that in the month of Shishlev in the 20th century, in the 20th year, as I was in Shuska the citadel, that Hananiah, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. I reckon Nehemiah at the beginning of this day thought it was going to be a fairly normal day. We know that Nehemiah was a cupbearer for the king of Persia. This is quite a highly regarded position. It sounds quite straightforward. He just bears the cup. But actually, it was a position of power, a position of influence. Nehemiah would have tested all of the wine that the king drank to make sure it hadn't been poisoned or spiked. He would have been in a really trustworthy position, a really high position, and probably had quite a lot of favor and honor with the king as well. But he also knew that that came at a price, that if he messed up, if he mucked up, that his life was probably on the line. We know Nehemiah was a Jew, that his family and his ancestors had probably been in Jerusalem and Judea, and that they had been spread as Babylon and Persia had taken over these lands, and they'd been spread all around. But Nehemiah has found himself in a very nice position. To be honest, we know from the book of Ezra that he could have probably gone, or his family could have gone back to Jerusalem before this. He was free to do that. However, probably because of his position with the king, he probably decided not to. He was probably far more comfortable where he was, doing what he was doing with the position that he had. And then his brother appears on the scene. His brother had been to Judah. He'd come back on an expedition, as I like to call it. I don't know if it was. We don't know why his brother was there, but we know that his brother had just returned that moment from Jerusalem. And Nehemiah asks, how was it? How was your trip? How was Jerusalem? What's going on? Fill me in. And I want to suggest, I wonder if at that point, everything begins to change for Nehemiah. Because up until this point, his world had been fairly comfortable. He had a good job, nice family, knew what he was doing, fairly comfortable living. And at this point, God decides to change what happens to him. Because what we see is with Nehemiah's brother's response, we see that Nehemiah sees what's going on. And this is the first step of the framework that I want to suggest. Because the book of Nehemiah begins with a conversation. But it ends at this section with Nehemiah's eyes being opened. Open to the idea that the city of Jerusalem and his people are in great trouble and distress. Nehemiah sees the problem potentially for the first time. He realizes how big an issue this is and how change needs to happen. He sees that the struggle is real. He sees that it's raw for his people, and it stops him in his tracks. He probably started that day off, as I've already mentioned, thinking it was going to be a normal day. After that one conversation with his brother, he now feels very different towards his life, towards what maybe God has in store for him, and towards what his role is in that place. But interestingly, Nehemiah stays in that moment. And when we're faced with moments of challenge, my first question for us this evening is, what is our response? When we're in that place that many of us are and probably have been recently, where things are different, we have to do something in a different way, we have to change our way of thinking or change how we do it, what do? How do we respond? Nehemiah prompts us, encourages us, his example encourages to stop and see. Because I think we're often tempted to offer a quick answer, maybe tidy up the mess and move on. Someone tells you they're having a difficult time or there's a problem or there's something going on. How many times do we say, oh, that's a shame. I'm really sorry. I might pray for you. We probably say we're going to pray, but you know. How many times do we say that's a shame and allow the next distraction to grab our attention? Rather than throw his hands up and turn away, Nehemiah shows us what it looks like to see that situation. Rather than getting on with his life, he stops and he says, no, there's something here that I need to understand. So Nehemiah sees. That's the first thing in this framework. He sees the problem. He sees the need for change. But what does he do next? I think it's the most obvious part of this passage. Because in verse 4 it tells us, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Nehemiah sees and sits in the presence of God. And it's in that place that he turns all that he's seen into a kind of heartbreak prayer that motivates everything that follows. And I wonder, or I want to suggest even, that we need to sit in that place when we see injustice, when we feel a shift or a change in our culture. We need to stop, sit, and allow God to speak before directly turning to action. Later in Nehemiah 2, that we read a few weeks ago, we see Nehemiah is in Jerusalem, and his first course of action is again to see for himself what's happening and what's going on. To look at the state of Jerusalem. Because what he's doing in this time, in this space, is working to understand the root of the problem so he can respond well. Now, Nehemiah doesn't move straight into action. And what he does next isn't him going in ready for a fight or for a change. But what we see is that he goes from a place of seeing, of praying, and at the end of this passage, at the end of chapter 1 into chapter 2, we see that he moves to a place of praying. Nehemiah's prayer here is one of great feeling, and it's the first of 12 prayers in this book. It even opens and ends with prayer. Prayer is important to Nehemiah. It's obvious that he is a man of faith who depends wholly on the Lord to help him accomplish the work he has called him to do. It is with this action that gave him the success he needed to move in the direction of seeing that change and that call that God had for him. But how did he pray? He broke it down into 3 sections. First of all, in verse 5, we see that the first thing he does is he praises God. The first thing that Nehemiah does when he turns to prayer is he thanks God for who he is, for what he's already done, and he gives him his place in his life, but also in this situation. In verses 6 to 9, we see Nehemiah confess his sin. He apologizes on behalf of his role and God's people that they have walked away. And that is why destruction of Jerusalem has happened. He recognizes that there is a fault in his life and the life of other people. But he ends with an expression of confidence Because he knows that in God's word, he has promised that when we turn away from you, yes, God, you will scatter us. But when we turn to you and come to you, you will regroup us, you will bring us back together, and you will dwell in that place. This is not a quick prayer before Nehemiah dives straight in to fix the problem. Nehemiah isn't looking here to go into Jerusalem all horses blazing and be like, right, we're going to fix these walls and the problem will be sorted. He knows that he needs God and he needs God's help in the middle of all of this. And it's through this conversational prayer that we see a really deep dive into Nehemiah and the situation that he is carrying concern for. We realize that Nehemiah is taking this really seriously. He's not like, oh, that's fine, I'll send some men and we'll fix it and it'll all be fine. He realizes that actually he needs to wait, he needs to sit and see, but he also needs to really take this concern and this burden to God and say, what do you want me to do about this? What is the next step? And I wonder how often we rush into action, giving prayer little thought or a passing nod as we head into a situation. That quick 2-second prayer because we've just remembered that God might be able to help us in that situation. Nehemiah's prayer comes from a place of seeing the situation and seeing that God was moving. He wanted to know what his role was, but he understood the process that he needed to go through before leaping into action. Because that's what he does next. He does move into action. We do see that happening in the beginning of chapter 2. Chapter 2 introduces that plan of action. At the end of his prayer in chapter 1, particularly verse 11, Nehemiah expresses his desire for success. And we see in chapter 2 what that first step of success looks like. And it involves approaching the king. Now, to be honest, this is probably not the first step that I thought Nehemiah would take. But he takes the opportunity that God gives him. The king recognizes that Nehemiah is not his usual self, that there is something troubling him. He's not unwell, realizes it's a problem of the heart. And the king actually asks him, what is wrong? That shows us how close this relationship was. And what does Nehemiah do? He prays. Takes it to God and said, what do you want me to say right now? And God tells him. Now Nehemiah, yes, tells us that he was scared, that he was unsettled, that he was anxious. But he tells the king of the God-given burden that he has. And asks him for permission to go. Asks him for permission to access materials, to get to that place without any trouble or without any hassle. Because what we see to begin the action of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, he needs to do this together. He doesn't do this alone. To bring back together the inequality that he's seeing, he needs to seek God, he needs to see, he needs to pray, and he needs to act. And because he uses this framework, we see far more than we or he probably could have ever expected. So what? Great story for Nehemiah. Worked really well for him. We know if you read the entire book of Nehemiah that he goes on to rebuild the walls. Yes, he faces opposition. Yes, he faces people who don't agree with what he's doing or what he's decided to do. But the walls are rebuilt. His plan, God's plan, takes shape and it happens. But what does that mean for you and me today as we continue into this new, in inverted commas, because we don't actually know what it's going to look like, world? As we see different things taking place, happening, rising to the surface, what does what Nehemiah did all those years ago, what does this framework mean for each of us? Well, think back to that idea of God speaking a new story, offering us an invitation to see and hear another story. Now, that's not because everything else doesn't exist or isn't important. I'm not telling you to ignore things this evening, but it's because the loudest voice isn't always the right one. Just like Nehemiah, we need to take time to step back, reflect, to see for ourselves what's going on. To see for ourselves what is God saying to each of us, to ask him, what are you saying? What are you asking me to do in this situation? But not just for ourselves, but we need to see what he's doing in others' lives, in our community, and in our church. And I wonder if we were to step back and ask those questions, what God would reveal to each of us. It's time to stop and see. Not just with eyes of panic, looking to wish away the headlines, to fix the mess, or find comfort in a Netflix binge session. We must see with eyes that are fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Because it's from that place and that place alone that we can turn to look at the world around us and truly see and begin the journey of building back better. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you give us the answers. That, Lord, in your word, we can see you at work in the lives of those who've gone before us. That we can take those lessons, we can take those frameworks, those ideas, we can see how they acted and what they chose to do. And we can follow that same plan. But ultimately, our aim is to seek you, to hear from you, to know what it is that you have for us. What does it look like for us to build back better? For your community, for your church, and for your people. And Father, as we reflect on that, as we take that time to stop and see and to pray before moving into action, we ask that we would be open to that we'd be open to your burdens, we'd be open to your questioning, we'd be open to your compassion and your love for your people. And that because of that, we would see more of you at work in our lives, in the lives of those around us, in this church and in this city, but also just in this world and this nation. In your name.